Well, today we'll examine another famous Bible story, Daniel in the lion's den. Anybody heard of that one? You probably have heard of that one. And so I'm going to start, though, if I may, I'm going to start with just a little bit of nitpicking. Sometimes you get to nitpick about Bible stories. Most of our children's depictions of this event show Daniel as a young man being thrown to the lions. And you see a lot of pictures of that in Sunday school books and in different books and literature. Daniel would have been a teenager when he refused the king's food back in chapter 1, when he was taken off as a captive to Babylon. And he would have been a young man when he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the statue, and Daniel came in and interpreted it and did that. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego probably would have been young men when they were cast into the fiery furnace, at least relatively young men at that point. However, by the time we get to Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel has lived through all of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and he reigned for over 40 years. And the transition into the Persian Empire. So probably, most likely, Daniel is in the neighborhood of about 60 years old. Okay, so let me just throw that out. We have, as we go through these 6 chapters, we have watched Daniel's life unfold. And so he's probably more closer to being a senior citizen than to being a youth when we get to the lion's den. Now, another interesting note that we'll make that's probably worth making in this passage is that we're going to bump into an age-old philosophical question. I don't know if we usually think about the Bible in these terms, but there are questions that have been through society. And one of the age-old questions, is the king above the law, or is the law above the king? I know that's what keeps you up at night, right? That question. You just wonder that. Well, you may have heard it expressed, lex rex or rex lex. Which way does that go? In most ancient societies, they saw the king as absolute. Whatever the king said, that's what you did. His word was law, and his person was above the law. He could change the law. You could not charge the king. In modern societies, we find that concept of an individual having absolute power is somewhat repulsive. I mean, we like our elected officials, our representatives and rulers to be held accountable. Right? It rarely works that way, but we like them to be held accountable. So we want them to follow the same laws that we have to follow, and that's kind of our philosophy. It may surprise you to know that the ancient Persian Empire would have somewhat agreed with us on that point of philosophy. They believed that the law was higher than the king, and that even the king could not break the law once it had been enacted. Once it was established, the king had to obey the law like everybody else. Now, that's going to come and be important in this story, and where they probably went a lot further than us is the idea that they were comfortable with is that they didn't believe the king could change the laws once they were established. Now, I'm sure our society has never made a stupid law that needed to be changed. I mean, but they got trapped, and it was one of their things. In ancient Persia, the law was supreme. And so this will cause some trouble, as we'll see in today's story. So we're going to enter the story, picking up where we left off last week. Babylon has fallen, Persia has taken over, and they had to establish order. And so that's what Darius goes about doing. And we're going to pick up Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. Those satraps would be accountable to them, so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and the satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. Now, satraps were like governors. They were the governors of the provinces in ancient Median and Persian Empire. We probably shouldn't quite think of them the way we do our governors, because our governors are elected officials that in theory answer to the people, but they would have been more like a viceroy. I know that's something we run into all the time, right? They were appointed to rule over an area as a direct representative of the king. And so they had pretty much total power of their area, but they answered to the king and represented him. The satrap would have been in charge of the land which he was assigned. He would have collected the taxes, controlled the local officials, and the subject, whatever tribes or cities were in his territory. He would have been the supreme judge, the court system of that province. They would have brought their cases, both civil and criminal, to him, and he would have decided those cases. He would have been responsible for the safety of the roads and to put down bandits and rebels, had his own little army for that province. However, if he failed in any of these duties, he would answer to the king. The administrators, there were 3 administrators over the satraps, and they would have been the eyes of the king. They would have routinely traveled the districts inspecting the work of the satraps. Now, Daniel puts it this way. He says, so that the king would not be defrauded. It would be the administrator's job to make sure the proper taxes were collected. Okay, these guys aren't collecting extra on the side and putting it in their pocket. They're collecting the right amount. The government was to be properly maintained. These administrators made sure the satraps were doing their job, that justice was being done in the king's name, so that the king's reputation would be protected. You might consider these administrators over the satraps to be like an inspector general. They did the inspections to make sure everything was run right. Now, this is what Daniel did. That was his job. And his job was to protect the king's interest in the work, supervising the work the satraps did. In fact, Daniel did this so well, and he was to such great benefit to the king, that the king was about to put him in charge of everything. He did a good job. Now, let me put it a different way, maybe kind of bringing it into context. Daniel was that goody-good employee whose job it was to keep an eye on everybody else. Y'all love that guy at work, right? That's what Daniel did. He made sure everyone got their work done properly, and he did a really good job at it. In fact, Daniel was a company man all the way. He always put the company's best interest first, the king, and the boss loved him for it. But his co-workers, not so much. And that's where we develop our problem in this story. So let's go to Daniel chapter 6, verse 4. The administrators and satraps, therefore, because Daniel did such a good job and was about to be put in charge, therefore, they kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy. And no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, we will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God. Now we should understand, these were all very powerful men. I mean, these 120 guys ruled the country, ruled the empire. The problem with power is that there are more people who want it than there is power to share. The higher you go up the ladder, the less room there is to move up. If you're a satrap, there's only 3 spots above you. And there's about to be one empty spot because Daniel's going to be put in charge of all of them. They all want that spot. See, there's lots of room at the bottom. Remember that when you're, in a position. There's lots of room at the bottom. It doesn't get crowded or lonely down there, or it doesn't get lonely, but it gets very lonely at the top. Everyone wanted a shot at that top job, and Daniel was about to get it because he was better at doing his job than any of them. The only way they could move up the ladder was to get him out of the way. Or you might think of it in terms of this way, because these would have been politicians. Think of it in terms of corrupt politicians. The only way you can get away with your corruption as a politician is if everyone is corrupt. I know that never happens. But it's the only way you're going to get away with it, is if everyone's corrupt, because then they can't expose you because you would expose them. If the king put an honest man at the top, then he would control all their corruption and it would all be exposed. So they've got to get rid of Daniel. We don't want Daniel. They searched for something that they could accuse him of, but they couldn't find anything. See, they had a difficulty in Daniel in that he was an honest man. This was something odd to them. They were politicians. He was an honest man. And even surrounded by politicians and bureaucrats, Daniel had remained honest and above reproach. That'd be like someone being in Congress for 40 plus years and still being honest. I mean, that's what Daniel pulled off. They knew the only way they'd ever be able to accuse Daniel of anything if it was due to his fanatical worship of his God. Because Daniel had one thing that he was fanatical about, one thing that was his highest loyalty, even above the government, above his job, above the king, and that was God. And they knew it. In spite of being imported to Babylon, as a teenager being carried off as a captive, in spite of now being conquered by Persia, Daniel still insistently worshiped the God of Israel. He was faithful. And apparently everyone knew it. He was open about his faith. Now this is worthy of us taking note of. See, doing everything right won't make people like you. In fact, it'll likely make them resent you. I don't know about you. I've had jobs where I did honest work. I was did what the boss wanted. I did the job, and my coworkers didn't like me for it. You ever been there? You made them look bad. People will sometimes resent you for doing what's right. And the world won't like your holier-than-thou morals when you refuse to bow to their greed and their quest for power, if it interferes with their plans. When they can't corrupt you, then they will attack your faithfulness to God. That's what we see with Daniel. Now, mark my words on this. We should brace ourselves because I believe we are about to experience some of this dynamic in our own society. Guys, our society is getting more and more hostile to Christianity. It's getting more and more hostile to scriptural truth. And if you have sin in your life, I'm going to tell you, this is a really good time to get rid of it, because if you don't, it's going to bite you. It'll bite you. And if you're doing what's right, then get ready to walk by faith. Get your eyes on Jesus. Get your eyes on Jesus. Walk by faith, because I'm going to tell you, we may have to at times take a trip through the lion's den. It's possible. Be prepared. Now anyway, this is where Daniel finds up. His enemies set a religious trap, knowing he would never abandon his faith. Daniel chapter 6, let's pick up in verse 6. So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever." All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the advisors, and the governors, have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Now, I suspect that's a lie, because I don't think Daniel agreed to it. They said all, right? Yeah, okay, I don't think so. Verse 8, "Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." So King Darius signed the written edict. Now, not only were they flattering the king into their trap, but they were feigning apparent loyalty and concern for the establishment of his kingdom. "Oh, king, we want everyone to pray to you. We want everyone to come to you. You're going to be the center of everyone's attention." Now remember, the Persians had just taken over from the Babylonians. This was still recent. This was still fresh. And so this is probably within, a year or two of that transition. And so the idea of having a 30-day period where loyalty to the king is mandated might sound fairly reasonable. I mean, we've just taken over from Babylon. We want everyone to focus on the king. He's the new king. We've got to make sure we solidify his power. We want everyone to pay attention to him. So they might have said something like, "Your Majesty, we need to make sure everyone sees that you're in charge for the good of the kingdom." But really what these guys were interested in was a trap. They weren't interested in the kingdom. They weren't interested in supporting the king. They were trying to trap the king, and it worked. They got him to agree to this law because it was unanimously approved, and it was a law that even the king could not break or change. Now, it might be worth noting at this point that feeding people to the lions and other wild beasts was actually a fairly common method of execution down through history. To us, it seems very strange. Lots of cultures have used such methods. I would imagine it was probably fairly cost-effective. I mean, you saved a lot of money on pet food, good deterrent, you didn't want to get fed to the lions. And really, the animals did your dirty work, so you didn't have to get messy with the execution. I mean, so there were a lot of ancient benefits to feeding people to the lions or the wolves or whatever. And so that's what they did in their time. Their trap worked. See, it worked on the king who fell for it. And he fell for it hook, line, and sinker. But it also worked to entrap Daniel. Because there was no law that was going to stop him from worshiping God. He would not stop praying. Law or no law, he was determined. He was going to bow before God 3 times a day and pray 3 times a day, just like always. Daniel didn't wait for governmental permission to worship God. He was determined to worship even if it was against the law and could cost him his very life. It's a thought we might do well to think in consideration. To what length and at what risk are we willing to worship God? What are you willing to risk to worship God? Oh, the government said I can't. Well, that's where Daniel was. That's exactly where Daniel was. Law said you're not allowed to do it. Look what Daniel does. Let's see what happens. Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he knew about it. He went into his house. The windows in his upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. When Daniel knew it was the law, he still went and prayed anyway. Verse 11. These men went up as a group and found Daniel petitioning, imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, as a law of the Medes and the Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. Verse 13. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased, and he set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, You know, your majesty, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no edict or ordinance of the king that the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order. And they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. And a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. And they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm. The king was overjoyed, And he gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. And the king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Politics can be a dangerous business. The trap you lay for your opponent might just wind up being the trap that catches you, especially if you oppose God and his people. We see that happening over and over in Scripture. Once again, God shows his power by saving his faithful servant. Now, there's actually a lot in this short passage. See, Daniel knowingly continues to pray regardless of the law, and his enemies knew he would. They were waiting to pounce, to catch him in the very act of prayer. And it makes us ask the question, a worthwhile question. Do our enemies know that we will continue to worship God no matter what? Oh, those Christians over there, they're going to worship Jesus no matter what you do. They will continue following Jesus. Do they know that about us? Do we display that type of unyielding faithfulness? See, we should show that kind of dedication to God, that kind of faith in God. Now, they immediately spring their trap. And once it happens, the king realizes he's been had. He tries to undo it. He wants to undo the damage, but to no avail. Why? Because the law is over the king in their culture, in Persia. He could not, even the king could not break the law. He could not change the law. So Daniel seemed doomed. The king had no choice but to follow the law, and so he does. Daniel is taken. He's thrown into the lion's den. The doorway is covered with a stone, and the king seals it with his signet ring and the signet rings of his nobles, showing they have followed the law. They have done what the law required. This would be like us putting a government seal on a document. They would carry a ring and actually make a wax seal and put it there, a stamp. And it showed that the judgment of the law had been carried out unbroken. But even though the king follows the law, he isn't happy about it. It's not what he wants. And he tells Daniel, he says, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." It's his hope that this God will rescue him. Now, maybe he's heard of the things that God did with Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know. But he's hoping that this God will rescue him. Now, I'm sure that wouldn't necessarily be a lot of comfort as you're about to be thrown in the lions. Well, we hope it goes well. May God bless you as you go. Not to mention, actually, I don't know if you've ever thought about it. Have you ever thought about how the lion's den would smell? You might wish you were dead. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they probably didn't clean it out a whole lot. But the king, he was upset. They threw Daniel in. They seal it. He goes home. He's upset. In fact, he spends the night fasting. He refuses any entertainment. He didn't even watch Netflix that night. I mean, he would not participate, in anything. He stays focused on mourning over Daniel until sunrise. He doesn't want to lose Daniel. Daniel's good. Daniel's the one guy he can trust. He feels bad. He's been trapped in this. And so when that light comes up, when the sun comes up, he hurries to the lion's den and he calls out to Daniel. This question, he says, "Has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Notice the question is one of God's ability. Daniel, I know you serve this God nonstop. You are so dedicated to him. But is that God actually able to save you in this circumstance? Can he do it? Is your God real? The king, I think, hoped that it would be, but he doesn't know. Guys, do our lives make people ask that question? Do people see us and wonder, is their God really real? I mean, look how dedicated they are. Look how much devotion they have to Jesus. Look at how they live for God and worship Him no matter what and commit themselves to Him no matter what. And He's always first in their life. Is He real? Can He really be so powerful and so good and His grace be so merciful? And maybe they even come hoping to find out that it's true. I think that's where Darius was. And that is what our life should be. They should be living testimonies of God's grace and power that make the world take notice. So the world will say to you, I want to know, is his God real? Is her God real? Can He do this? Daniel's response from in the lion's den is interesting. He's still faithfully loyal to the king. In fact, he starts his response with, may the king live forever, which seems to be what they're all supposed to say when you greet the king. But you know, some people might have been a little sore with the king over the whole execution thing. I mean, you know, if you'd just been thrown to the lions, are you still so loyal to the king? Some people actually might have been a little bit gloating over, hey, the lions did not touch me. Hey, king, guess what? I mean, but Daniel doesn't start that way. He starts off with, may the king live forever. He is still loyal to the king. And he calls out from the lion's den, yes, my God has saved me. Yes, He can. That's what the world needs to hear. They need to see a God in our life and see, yes, God really makes a difference. He sent the angel and shut the mouths of the lions, and here I am as the proof. See, Daniel's the living proof to the king that God had the power to do what He said. God is more powerful than the lions. Now, I started off with the question of what's higher, the law or the king, and I think that question misses the point because God's higher than all of them. He's in charge. An interesting thing, these guys set an interesting trap for the king, a trap for Daniel, but they missed a couple little loophole things, and I think firstly God took advantage of it. They made a law that anyone who prayed had to be thrown in the lion's den. Right? That's what the law said. Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, they kept the law. Didn't actually make it the law that the lions had to eat them. See, God worked through that little loophole right there, right? Now, I want you to understand, lions are smarter than whales. Lions know that prophets taste bad. The whale had to find out the hard way. That's a different story. Okay. So the law was carried out. Daniel had been thrown into the lion's den, but God protected him. The lions didn't eat him. The law didn't stay that he had to be eaten. It said he had to be thrown in. So when Daniel had followed the law, they had followed the law, the lions didn't eat him, he can come back out. New day. Daniel's enemies also didn't think about one other part. They also didn't think about the fact that the king might get mad. He might make some more decrees, like one to throw all of them in the lion's den. Oops. Missed that little point, huh? I mean, he can make some new satraps. Actually, there's a story about Abraham Lincoln. Apparently, during the Civil War, a Confederate cavalry unit kidnapped one of the Union generals, him and his horse. They said Lincoln was very upset. The horse would have cost $50. He could make a new general. I suspect this runs in that vein, guys. I mean, you know, the king can get rid of them. I don't know why they weren't thinking of that, but they missed the point. Now, at the end of the day, this was another opportunity for God to display His awesome power in the lives of one of His faithful servants. The bad guys are thrown in the lion's den with their families, and they don't even hit the ground before the lions devour them. Must have been quite a few lions, I would imagine. Now, it's actually an important detail in the story, because, see, understand, the lions didn't eat Daniel. But it's not because they weren't hungry. It's not because they couldn't hurt someone or eat someone. It's because God protected Daniel. God sent His angel to close the mouths of the lions. And the moment someone else was thrown in without God's protection, those hungry lions went to work. In fact, they had missed dinner, so they were ready for breakfast. And this all had a very profound effect on Darius. It became yet another testimony of God's great power over the affairs of the world. And like Nebuchadnezzar, who wrote a letter proclaiming God's gloriousness, Darius does it here as well. Look at verse 25, Daniel chapter 6. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Just like Nebuchadnezzar had done, Darius writes this letter proclaiming God's power that had been shown through these miraculous events. And he sent that letter out and announced to the people of the empire, all the nations that they had conquered, all the nations that were under their control. He announces to them, this is the God that you'd better fear, because he can do these great things. He rescued Daniel from the lion's den. Now, this is a great story, and it's a favorite of many. But more than just knowing the story, we would do well to live the story. So we should live like Daniel. Daniel's one of the great Bible heroes. There's no mention of Daniel ever doing anything wrong. He's faithful to God to the end. He's committed to Him. That's the way we should be. No matter the circumstances we face in life, and understand, we all face difficult circumstances, don't we? Every one of us has problems. Whatever those problems are, we should be radically devoted to God in the middle of those circumstances. Our devotion to God should be so undeniable that everyone around us knows it. No matter what happens in this world, that person's going to follow Jesus. The army of God, understand, the army of God has no secret service where we go hide our faith. We are called to be lights in the world, shining. Not hiding our light, shining our light, displaying it. Why? So that God will be glorified. That's what happened with Daniel. He lived devoted to God, and the result was everybody knew it, and when times got difficult, God was glorified. Do we do that? Do we live our life on the edge, devoted to God no matter what, so that in our every struggle, in our every difficulty, even in the traps the world puts in our way, and the world will put traps in your way, guys, they become opportunities for God to be glorified. Is every bad circumstance in your life an opportunity for God to be glorified? So understand, you cannot be a Daniel in the lion's den if you won't first be a Daniel devoted to prayer. The reason Daniel was rescued in the lion's den, the reason he went to the lion's den, is he was devoted to God in prayer. He was going to pray 3 times a day no matter what. He was going to worship God. You cannot see God's power saving you from the mouth of the lions if you won't defy the powers of this world when they oppose God. That's what he did. He stood up to the power of earth, the main power, the number one guy, the emperor of earth. Said, no, I'm going to worship God. Got him thrown in the lion's den. Got him rescued from the lion's den. But you can't get there if you won't stand up for God when the powers of this world oppose God. And understand, the powers of this world will oppose God. We live in hostile territory. You can't have a great testimony for God until first you pass a great test. Or maybe it's been said, there is no testimony without a test. See, I don't know about y'all. James tells us to rejoice when suffering comes upon us. We tend to not rejoice. We tend to say, oh, I don't want any more. I've had enough. This year has already been too long. But see, it's those tests, those trials, those tribulations that give us the opportunity to have a great testimony, because it's in those moments that God can show His great power. You look through the Bible of every example of God intervening by His great power in the lives of one of His people, and it was always when they had a problem. That's what He did it. Well, what will we do? What will we do? I would suggest that in a world full of plotting satraps, there's plenty of them out there, we should dare to be a Daniel. Dare to be faithful. Dare to be fully 100% dedicated to God, come what may, and trust God for the outcome.